Welcome to the Fiction Workshop with Dr. M. The doctor is in.
Welcome to the Fiction Workshop. I'm Dr. M. We have a novel excerpt today. Bob Johnson sent in part of a novel. It was something that he had published with an independent press. He was curious about maybe trying to get it published somewhere else. And I think that that's really difficult to do. I have seen it happen occasionally. Usually it's with a writer who gets published on a small press, and then for one reason or another, the writer becomes a little bit bigger than the press, and then a big press swoops in, buys up the novel. And so it could be they won an award. It could be that a director was interested in the book, something like that. It is pretty rare. So once something's been published, it can be difficult to get published again. Regardless, we're going to talk about this today. Couple things. This is a vampire novel, and so it would be considered genre fiction. And also, because we get the first chapter of a novel, for a writing workshop, these are usually two strikes against the writer. It may seem a little unfair, but in writing workshops, they're mostly set up to deal with short stories, and they're mostly set up to deal with literary short stories. This has to do with the fact that a lot of times they're at universities, they're a little bit hoity-toity, a little bit elitist. They know that. They want writers who are going to produce literary writing, and because they're headed by writers who are producing literary writing. Generally, you're going to have an MFA, a Master's in Fine Arts, to be able to teach at an institution like this. So you've gone through the system yourself, and it weeds out a lot of folks. I have taken writing workshops where it was explicitly stated that you shouldn't hand in genre fiction. I do think that that's changed. And I think it's a little unfair. You got writers growing up on Harry Potter, something we would consider genre fiction. And if you want to write about wizards and magic spells and kids going to wizard school, it wouldn't necessarily be taken seriously. But then you got a whole class full of writers who grew up on that and are interested in that and would like to maybe even try that. So I do think that it's changing. I see workshops or writing programs that are trying to, branch out and include screenwriting, even screenwriting for video games. I do see them want to hire professors who can also do genre fiction. It's a recognition that there is a demand for it. The advantages of genre fiction is that you have entire presses, you have large readerships, you can make good money, and the expectations are different, and so that's what makes it difficult in a literary writing workshop. All of that aside, it may not even matter for us, but I just wanted to say something about it just because, if you want to take a writing workshop and the kind of writing that you're doing would be considered genre, so it could be a Western, it could be science fiction, it could be fantasy, in this case it's a vampire novel, the readership of literary writers may not be prepared to respond to that. And that's fair. A fair response would be, I wouldn't normally read something like this. I don't normally read vampire novels. And usually in the writing workshop, what they'll do is they'll say, if you learn to write literary work, it will help you write your genre work. If you're learning about character and how to make the sentences better and all that stuff, it should carry over into almost any kind of fiction writing. And there is some truth to that, but it's also nice to have a receptive audience or an audience that understands the tropes of, let's say, vampire fiction writing. Bob Johnson is published under the name R. Clare Johnson. Child of Time was published in 2013. The book was showing promise when the publisher went out of business in 2015. Bob sent in the excerpt because he's interested in making improvements to the book and sending it out and trying to find another publisher. This is an excerpt from Child of Time.
As the recollection of this and other atrocities burned in his mind, awareness of the present situation began pushing those memories aside. Joswiak's been laying low for a long time, but apparently it's decided to come back out in the open. I'm going to get it this time. If I don't, there's no telling when I'll have another chance. There's no telling how much more horror it'll unleash. He turned his attention to the injured policewoman. I suppose the best way to deal with her situation will be simply to tell her what happened and hope that rekindling her memory will bring her back to coherence without me intervening. Since I'll eventually erase any memory of me or this incident from her mind, I guess there's nothing to lose in telling her the truth. Offering her more water, he spoke softly but firmly. You may find this hard to believe, but you were attacked by a vampire. What? She exclaimed. That's crazy. What are you talking about? Again, in a very calm and self-assured way, he replied, I know it sounds crazy, but think about what you experienced, what you saw and felt. Look around you. Things have happened that have no explanations, that are rational as you understand the word. Why not trust me until you've had time to reflect on what's happened? She hesitated while looking around. What happened with my windshield? It's stuck over there. And just who the hell are you? He replied, I did that. I'm sorry. I'll get it fixed for you. I had to use it because I needed something to take that creature out before it hurt you, and there wasn't anything else around that would work. She shook her head and put her hands on her cheeks. I can't believe any of this. And again, just who the fuck are you? Where did you come from? Why are you here? A smile spread across his face. I know this is an awful lot of unbelievable stuff, and I'm probably not doing a very good job of explaining it. Let's start over. Here, let me help you up. He stood up, leaned over, and extended his hand. She reached up and took it. For the first time, she took note of his appearance. He was a little taller than average, with longish, scruffy, light brown hair. He was very muscular and appeared to be in his 30s, but his most striking feature was his eyes. One was blue and the other was green. He wore dark cargo pants, black Vietnam boots, and a dark shirt with a Roman collar with the buttons on one shoulder. When she took his hand, she jerked and smiled slightly. His touch added to her confusion. Who is this guy with his cock and bull story? I should get the hell away from him as fast as I can, but something about him seems real. He doesn't strike me as a nut or a bullshit artist, and he did save my life. I'll listen to what else he's got to say. He helped her steady herself and gave her the water bottle again. Here, you keep this. The reason that you're feeling woozy is that the vampire imposed its will into your mind and clouded your consciousness. They have the ability to control people, and your mind hasn't yet cleared itself completely of what it forced on you. The good news is that I don't think it had enough time to do much damage, and you should be okay in an hour or so. When they're able to really get into someone's head, they can cause severe anxiety and disorientation, but usually, if it gets to that point, you're dead anyway. They're predators that prey on people, and if you're around one of them for long, you wind up dead. But I'm getting ahead of myself. His real name was unknown and meaningless to almost all people. Those few who ever knew about his existence called him many things, including Seeker of the Sun, Child of Time, Counterbalance, Eidolon, and, among vampires, the Day Feeder. This time he introduced himself as Lathan Devers. I'm very glad to meet you. I wish we could have met under more pleasant circumstances, but your acquaintance is my pleasure nonetheless. Anyway, the thing I just killed was a vampire. That's right, a blood-sucking, living dead creature of the night, just like the legends. You can call them Verdalax, Nosferatu, Strigoi, or vampires. But regardless, they're real.
So our main characters are Devers, who is sort of an anti-vampire, maybe a vampire killer, but he's a good supernatural entity. We have Shelley, who is a highway patrol officer in Wyoming. And then we have sort of an unnamed, well, he's not unnamed, I don't remember the name, I'm sorry. We have also a vampire. There is some back and forth in terms of time. My suggestion was to start with I think it's about 300 years in the past. I may have that wrong. It may be longer than that. In Chechnya is where the vampire and the vampire killer originally encounter each other, or at least one of the times they encounter each other in the past. And this comes in the middle. So we have a section at the beginning of the novel where Shelley, the state trooper, is having an internal monologue. She's trying to solve a case. A couple things about internal monologue. First of all, the use of italics is good. It signals to the reader in a formalistic way, using the typeface, this is inside the character's head. Now, in most writing in the narrative, we can often be inside the character's head without doing the internal monologue, and you can include thoughts along with other types of observation, and it can be more objective, or it can be more personalized, or it can be more internal. In this case, we do have a long internal monologue where she's thinking about the case. I think that because we use the italics and because it's signaling that it is more internal than just the regular narrative, it's a good idea to really signal it with the language as well. So the modern writers, for example, James Joyce or Faulkner, would do stream of consciousness writing where you're trying to get as close as you can to the thoughts of the person, and so it's not even really in sentences. And this kind of thing can be done. It's not really necessary, but what we do need is something that's going to really signal more in terms of internal thoughts and feelings, and it may be impressions. So it could be more impressionistic. It doesn't necessarily have to be in solid sentences. The idea being that we don't necessarily think in perfect sentences. Now, this has been critiqued. Can language really approximate thought patterns? And so, for the modern writers, this was an experiment, but it was also a form of maybe even could be considered extreme realism. Now, monologues are hard to write because it has to sustain the interest of the writer without breaking up into dialogue, without interacting with other characters necessarily. Some of the more famous monologues, obviously we would think of Shakespeare. Now, he pulls it off by being poetic. You've got poetic language there. Some recent TV shows do monologues. I think This Is Us is one of the famous ones. The HBO show Deadwood. Now, Deadwood would be kind of Shakespearean in the language, and that's how they would pull it off. I think This Is Us is just very dramatic, very emotional, and it's something that's actors like it because it's challenging. If you try out for a role, you do a monologue. But to have that on the page without the actor, the writing has to really be very strong. So if what we're getting at is plot points, which is what I think we have here because she's trying to solve the case, it can come out in other ways. So I'm conflicted. I like the idea of a monologue. I think if you want to do it, it should be about more than just thinking about the case, something personal, something internal, maybe even that I have an itch, or that I'm hungry, or I've got a slight headache, so we expect things to be a bit more physical and reminding us that you're not just inside someone's head, but that head is in a body. So this is on page 11, and I want to look at a passage here. Some of what's happening is that a lot of the plot is coming through dialogue. Now, for much of the story, I think what the writer seems to be struggling with is the point of view. What's the best way to tell this story? So we have Devers, who is many centuries old. He's sort of an anti-vampire, kind of a vampire hunter. And the way it's set up is that he is the yin to the yang. So if vampires are dark, then he's light. I think this is an interesting idea. And I think readers would be kind of won over by this. Now, We're only getting one chapter, so we don't get the whole mythology of that. But we have Shelley is the other main character, and she's present day. She is a highway patrol in Wyoming. She's been, quote unquote, attacked by a vampire, and this has made her disoriented. So the passage is where Davers is explaining some of this to her after it's happened. His real name was unknown and meaningless to almost all people. Those few who ever knew about his existence called him many things, including Seeker of the Sun, Child of Time, Counterbalance, Eidolon, and among vampires, the Day Feeder. Now, the difference between the first two paragraphs here and the last paragraph here is stark. There is an authoritative third-person omniscient narrator that emerges after this dialogue. The dialogue is trying to explain a lot, and it's doing the work that this narrator should be doing. I would establish this voice and this narrator early. It stands out here on page 11 because we haven't really heard it quite in this way. The other thing that I suggested to you was that another character could come along later to do a lot of the explaining. Maybe there's someone who knows the history of vampires and day feeders, I don't know, at a curiosity shop or in a vampire chat group or something, I don't know. But for this character to be engaged in this way and to explain who he is to this woman is going to be a lot for a reader to take in. Mostly it's that the dialogue becomes it's a little exhausting to read that much and to believe that it would come through in dialogue. It's unnatural. There's a book by a famous editor, Rust Hills, who was an editor at Esquire. And I don't remember the name of the book, but Rust Hills wrote a book about writing. And one of the points that stuck in my mind, something I've learned from him, was don't do plot points through dialogue. And I think it's good advice. It makes readers sort of see through what you're doing. Generally, the work of the narrator, or if you give it to a minor character and that's their purpose, is to come along and to either be an explainer or to be a novice, someone who doesn't know much about what's going on, and then things can be explained to that character. In this case, Shelley's the novice, and Devers is the one who has the knowledge, but it's a lot for him to be there to engage with a vampire, to try to help her out and to try to explain things to her as she's coming to. The other thing I would say here is with the first piece of dialogue, you is one of these words that we've got to watch out for. We use it all the time in casual conversation, but if we look at the usage here, you've got the reason you're feeling woozy is that the vampire imposed its will into your mind and clouded your consciousness. Now, this is correct. This is how we should use it. But what gets confusing is when it switches to what I'm going to call the casual you. So what I'm calling the casual you is it's a third person, but in conversation we often substitute with second person. And it's just to speak about someone in general. Here we have, they have the ability to control people, and your mind hasn't yet cleared itself completely of what it forced on you. So what it does, and this is fine most of the time in dialogue, except for the fact that we've already used you earlier in this piece of dialogue. It's really they, or people. I'm sorry, people is the third person, so we have people and your, and it can create confusion, especially because of the use of you earlier in this piece of dialogue. Normally, I would want to edit out the your mind and forced on you because of that possible confusion. It would be forced on them. It would be forced on people. And it's pretty particular. It's being really correct here. But when it's in writing, it's better to be correct, and it's better to be particular than to allow for the confusion that it may create. That's the workshop. There's a email at the end if you want to send in a story. Thank you to Bob. Good luck with the novel. There's an email address at the end if you want to send a story. You can be anonymous. I will send you a more thorough private critique, and I will be honest with you. I'll tell you what you're doing well. I'll tell you, what I think could be improved, and I will dig in deep and look at the sentences and look for things that might help your writing and help other writers who come across these videos in the future. All right, thank you and goodbye.